खण्डनं भवबन्धनं जगद्बन्धनं वन्दे जानम नाररूपं धारं निरञ्जनं नाररूपं धारं जानम विमलं नयनं ज्ञानाञ्जनं विमलं नयनं विखनिं भास्कर भाव सागर चिर उन्माद प्रेम पाथा भक्तार जानम युगल चारण भक्तार जानम युगल चारण तारण भव युग ईश्वर जगदीश्वर योग सहाय नीरं धानं समाहित मानं नीरं धानं समाहित मानं निरखिं तव कृपा भञ्जनं दुःखं गञ्जनं करुणाघनं कर्म कठोर प्राणार्पणं जगत तारणं प्राणार्पणं जगत तारणं कृन्तनं कलिदो वाञ्छनं कामं काञ्चनं प्रतिनिन्दितं इन्द्रियं शारं हें नारं वारं त्यागीश शारं हें नारं वारं देह पदं करुं निर्भयं गातं संशयं निश्चयं मनसा निष्काम रानं भक्त शरणं निष्काम रानं भक्त शरणं त्यजे जाति संपदं तव श्रीपादं भव गोष्पादं वारि यथा प्रेमार्पणं क्षमं दारं शानं प्रेमार्पणं क्षमं दारं शानं जग जानं दुःख संपद तव श्रीपद भव गोष्पद वारियथाय प्रेमार्पण समदर्शन प्रेमार्पण समदर्शन जग जन दुःख जाय नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्यमनादित नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्यमनादित मन वचनैकाधार प्रभु मन वचनैकाधार ज्योतिर ज्योति जल हृदय कंदर ज्योतिरज्योतिर्जलहृदिकन्दर तुमितम भञ्जनहार प्रभु तुमितम भञ्जनहार नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्यमनादित नमो नमो प्रभु वाक्यमनादित मनवचनैकाधार प्रभु मनवचनैकाधार ज्योतिरज्योतिर् जलहृदिकन्दर ज्योतिरज्योतिर् जलहृदिकन्दर तुमितम भञ्जनहार प्रभु तुमितम भञ्जनहार हृदय लंग रंग भंग बाजे अंग संग मृदंग हृदय लंग रंग भंग बाजे अंग संग मृदंग गायছে छंद भक्त वृंद आरती তোমার গাইছে ছন্দ ভক্ত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার জয় জয় আরতি তোমার হর হর আরতি তোমার শিব শিব আরতি তোমার খান্দান ভাব বন্ধন गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ओम ह्रीं ऋतं त्वमचलो गुणजित गुणेभ्यः नाक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्तयलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्त्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसां त्वयि तृप्त तृष्णां रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि रामकृष्णे मर्त्यामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्मि नाशं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारे श्रान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नामनाथ यस्मादहं शरणं जगदेकगम्यं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गल माङ्गल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यम्बके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टि स्थिति विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातनी गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागतो दीनार्तो परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्थे हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
नमः श्री यतिराजाय विवेकानंदसूरये सच्चित् सुखस्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे। All right, so last time we had read this second paragraph of Vivekananda's lecture on Maya and illusion, where he mentions that there are some faint echoes of modern scientific theories these have been sort of anticipated in some form, not in detail, and whenever there has been an attempt to work out the details, there have been mistakes. And we were trying to understand this from two perspectives. One, what is the study that what he calls the Vedic thinkers, very courageous and wonderfully bold in propounding large and generalized theories, coming to the principle. This is the sentence he makes. He mentions, coming to the principles, we find these Vedic thinkers very courageous and wonderfully bold in propounding large and generalized theories. So the question is, what is it that Vedas, or more precisely, the Vedanta and the Upanishads, what is it that they are trying to study? And then when it comes to the details, and we were trying to understand what exactly he means by the details, they made mistakes. Why did they make mistakes? And why is, so for example, I mean, where exactly is the incompleteness of the form that science took at the beginning of the 20th century that Vivekananda is referring to here? These were the questions that we were trying to answer. First question, what exactly is the subject that these Vedantic thinkers were trying to study? What is the problem that they were trying to address? See, as soon as you have a problem or a collection of problems that forms a theme or a subject of study, it defines for you a certain context. These frameworks by which we attempt to understand reality are almost by definition limited. Why? Because we necessarily train the mind into focusing its attention on one particular aspect of reality. That is the nature of the human mind. It can't grasp this entire whole, so it takes a particular view of that reality and tries to understand reality in terms of this particular window to it. Yeah? So what we are trying to get at here is, what is the window that these Vedantic thinkers were looking through? One. Two, what was the window that science determined at the turn of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century? And how has that window changed? In other words, how has the scientific worldview changed over the 20th century so that today, in the 21st century, the notion of consciousness is not anywhere near as taboo as it was maybe, say, 30 years or so back. In other words, it is on the verge of becoming a scientific problem today. The framework may be not entirely clear. However, questions are being raised, greater clarity is being obtained, till it has come to a point where at least what is not well defined is becoming clearer and clearer. In other words, in order to address the problem should be clearly stated. And the problem of consciousness was not clearly stated even 30 years back. It's becoming clearer with the passage of time. And the sense that there is some truth here worth investigating using the methods that science has given us in the 20th century, this conviction is dawning on the scientific, on a substantial part of the scientific community. And so here is the first problem that we will, let's go back and try to understand. See, these are the broad frameworks need to be clear. What is the framework through which the Vedic or Vedantic thinker is trying to look at the world? What are the problems that they are trying to address? And as we have mentioned here several times, they turn, so to speak, their view inwards, which means what? To cut a long story short, what they are really trying to do, what is their object of study, what is the point at which they start? Basically, they start with the mind. In other words, the laboratory that they work in is this human psychophysical system. And through inquiry, through thorough investigation, what they are trying to do is trying to understand this internal nature, so to speak. The fact that we have a body and identify with it basically gives rise to, in our mind, this dichotomy. There is a nature that is outside and there is a nature that is inside. In that sense, medicine, which was not developed at the time these Vedic thinkers were trying to formulate problems, would be an internal science. Why? Because we don't see the circulation of blood, etc., etc. However, that was not the subject on which the Vedantic thinkers focused their attention. For them, the starting point from which various empirical data observations were drawn was this world of subjective phenomena. And the question that they are trying to answer is, what are these subjective phenomena in detail, just as all material particles today, with the advancement of the physical sciences, today we understand that all matter, whatever that is composed of certain elementary particles. The electron in the light, the electron in this mic, in me, in you, in some Andromeda galaxy, on the other side of the universe, there is nothing different from the electrons that compose. I mean, the electron here is not different from the electron there. So these constituent particles, there is a certain universality about them. This is the hallmark of a scientific query, of a scientific inquiry. A similar thing, but now not in the world of what we call matter, but in the world of what we call mind, was analyzed by these thinkers, and universal aspects of this subjective part of our being was analyzed thoroughly. This analysis, in the ultimate generalization, leads to this notion of the Atman. Okay? Consciousness, pure consciousness, unfettered by any limitations. This was the object of this. This was the window through which our Vedantic thinkers were thinking, and this is the direction towards which they were headed. All right. Now, that was so we've now addressed one of the questions that we started this discussion with. Namely, we have now some understanding of what is the window through which our Vedantic thinkers are trying to understand reality. And broadly, the subject of their enquiry, if we have to say it in simple words today, is A, the mind, B, consciousness. That's what they are after. All right. Now, what was the scientific position at the beginning of the 20th century? And the position was one of fairly uncompromising determinism. And in our philosophical thinking also, this determinism does sneak its way through. But what is the kind of hard determinism that was there? And in today's language, that would be called a certain kind of reductionism. In other words, in order to understand this human being, this subject, it is enough to understand physical reality. In other words, it is enough to understand electrons, protons, and their constituent. I'm sorry, I thought I had silenced this, but yeah, okay. So here the scientific deterministic viewpoint was trying to basically say that these constituent particles, electrons, protons, etc., these combine together to give more complex molecules. These are arranged, and finally, a particular kind of arrangement of those throws up this human body. And the explanations are pretty strong in the sense that, the human mind cannot conceive of anything more than, say, maybe even 1,000 years. Do we know a detailed history of the last 1,000 years of the human race? No. Which is why there is so much conflict in terms of, say, whenever there are various theories of history that come up, right? Somebody puts forward one point of view, another point puts forward another point of view. This is an indication that the study of society, of human beings as such, is fraught with conflict of opinion. Yeah? What the scientific position was trying to do was to reduce all this in some sense. This is the point of reductionism, that look, there are these elementary particles, these bring up certain molecules, these combine together in a certain form of organization which we call life. And Darwin's theory of natural selection basically said that, look, there is no intent or will in the way that we human beings think of a will. There is no such thing in the universe. And what is happening is, out of pure chance, certain things get selected, and those are the things that survive and go on. And when we as human beings try to grasp this locus, this trajectory of evolution, we attribute intent to it. Because we as human beings function with intent, and therefore this anthropomorphism of saying that, look, I have an intention, as a human being, I have a certain goal towards which I go, therefore this universe has a goal. This, in their language, is essentially casting a very narrow human anthropomorphic view on the evolution of something that is much greater than us, namely this universe, even life on earth. Yeah? Goes back several billion years. We as human beings can't even think of our entire life. We forget what has happened to us as children. So how can we possibly impose this very limited view of ourselves on the way the universe moves? These were the two views that were in sharp conflict with each other. One, which tries to understand everything from a purely subjective point of view. The other, the scientific worldview, which tries to understand everything from an objective point of view and where all the subjective phenomena are in principle reduced to the elementary particles that constitute objective nature. These are now points of view. Yeah? And when Vivekananda says that in working out the detail, these Vedic thinkers made mistakes, it's basically when they discover things through this subjective window and try to apply it to objective reality. That's when they make mistakes. Why? The context in which these ideas came up, namely the analysis of the subject, are not relevant to objective reality. They cannot be applied because that has not been some input to their analysis. They have not looked by means of instruments into the finer structure of matter. Therefore, the guesses and the speculations they make when it comes to objective reality, there are mistakes. Yeah. So this is the crucial problem that was being addressed here. Okay. All right. So now let's come to the scientific thing, and what exactly is it about? What exactly about it is it that Vivekananda is creating? Is basically putting forward a critique about. Essentially, this worldview saying that, look, everything is, so what exactly is the problem with a reductionist worldview? And that's the problem that we are trying to address. Yeah? Why is there a problem in thinking about ourselves and our consciousness as a product of these elementary particles? And for that, as we had mentioned last time, there was this fundamental advance that we described towards the end of last time's discussion, namely the discussion of space, time and matter as one unified theory by Einstein. Yeah? Space, time, matter as a fundamental entity. One. The other major advance, and there are striking parallels between that and this kind of thought, in the early 20th century, in physics, was quantum mechanics. And even today, the philosophical understanding of what it really entails is not something about which everybody is on the same page. So in its simplest form, precise but simple form, what does it say? It basically says there is some particular manifestation of that, something called the uncertainty principle. So what is the uncertainty principle? If you look at an elementary particle, it is not possible in terms of physical law to know both its position and its momentum simultaneously with absolute precision. In other words, if the degree of certainty with which you know a position of a particle is some number x, and the degree of uncertainty with which you know the position of another particle, of its momentum y, is y, then this x times y, the product of these uncertainties, roughly speaking, is not, it's the total uncertainty in both, in both of them cannot be zero simultaneously. This is roughly speaking the content of the uncertainty principle. Now, what is the scale of this uncertainty? It's something incredibly small, because if it was something larger, then you'd say, oh, I don't know how much that this is me, this physical body is me, and I am standing here. I am standing here moving, not moving at all. No, that's not the point. We are looking at things at a much finer scale, And the degree of uncertainty is given by something called the Planck's constant, which has units like 10 to the power minus 34. 1 divided by 1 followed by 34 zeros. So that's a minuscule thing. But what it says, what the philosophical implication is, that if you start looking at this worldview in terms of reductionism to elementary particles, then beyond a point, which is very low, which is very, very small, but the human mind and the way it grasps reality, there is a constitutional lack of certainty to it. It's a very small amount, but it is there. This was another major intellectual advance, a major change in the way we grasp reality, in the sense that naive determinism, which is what gives rise to all these astrological beliefs, for instance. I mean, you say something here, and that's going to determine for you perfectly what is going to happen 10 years hence. That kind of naive determinism was essentially thrown out of the window so even elementary particles do not follow it. There is an intrinsic uncertainty to things which is very small. This was, so the first one, the discovery of relativity, which essentially unified this framework in terms of which we grasp reality, namely space, time, and matter, into one entity. And the other major advance, the other major pillar of 20th century physics, quantum mechanics, which basically says that at a very small scale, so space, time, matter, relativity deals with things at an enormous scale. The scale of the universe, light years, the amount of distance traveled by light in a year. That's the kind of scale that where relativity really has its full relevance. Whereas quantum mechanics is at the other end of the spectrum, at the very, very small scale, 10 power minus 34. Yeah? Where exactly? So, for example, I mean, here is a place where if we are intellectually lazy and sloppy, then we can simply say, oh, yes, this was said in such and such place, Ano Raniyan, Mahatomahiyan. That's not what this is about. What was said in poetic language is now being nailed down with precision. The poetry could not predict phenomenon. Could not predict phenomena, the science can. This is the difference between imagination and insight in terms of poetry and the other end of the spectrum where you can precisely predict and basically come up with statements saying that, look, this is the kind of phenomenon that will happen. And this particular strength of science is what is called falsifiability. You can think of it as verifiability. What is a kind of instance of this phenomenon? So, for example, before the discovery of relativity, people thought, using Kepler's laws and Newton's laws, that the trajectories of planets around the sun would be perfectly elliptical, and they should be if relativistic effects did not happen. What did the relativistic theory say? It essentially says that, look, these are not independent aspects. I mean, these are not independent things. The space-time fabric and this massive body moving around it, these are not independent. They are one unified whole called space-time matter. What it explained was the fact that Mercury, which is the closest planet to the sun, does not really move in a perfect ellipse. There's a certain precession. I mean, it moves in and out of an elliptic orbit. So it was explaining some observation, some observed phenomena that was not explained by earlier ideas, by earlier concepts. This, this is what gives strength to a scientific theory. This is called verifiability or falsifiability. There was another major prediction that came out of relativity, which is what? Essentially, that light, which was thought to travel in straight lines before the theory of relativity, actually is supposed to bend a little bit when it passes close to a massive body. And so the prediction was that during an eclipse, when the sun's rays were not visible, then you could actually test whether light coming from distant stars did actually bend around the sun, which is a massive body. So the problem was that it could not be done otherwise, because the sun, on top of being massive, also emanates a huge amount of light, which means all the light coming from distant stars is going to be completely ignored in the presence of the brightness of the sun. So the only way you could test out this this prediction of relativity is to test the bending of light around the sun during the time that the sun's rays were not reaching the earth, which means in terms of at the time of an eclipse, for which one had to actually, there was another famous scientist had to go to one of the poles, most probably Antarctica, and look and test this out. This was something that was very counterintuitive. It went against conventional wisdom. People always thought that light travels in straight lines. Even today, you ask a man on the street, they'll say, yeah, light travels in straight lines, because that's our common sense experience. Now, this says that, look, if you look at it at a finer scale, it does bend. And so, the strength of a theory, of a scientific theory, is this falsifiability. It is, in some sense, sticking one's neck out, saying that, look, this is what should be true. Evaluate it. Evaluate it by experiment, by empirical observation. It does not depend on your opinion, on my opinion, on any politician's opinion, on any saint's opinion, on any sinner's opinion. It does not depend on the opinion of anybody. It is a fact which anybody can observe. In other words, universality and verifiability and falsifiability go together. Truth does not have to hide itself under the cloak of opinion. This is what gave strength to it. So so these two discoveries changed our worldview, changed the scientific worldview. One, relativity. Two, quantum mechanics. Another, now came a certain difficulty. So the critique that was there was against a naive determinism which was prevalent at the beginning of the 20th century. And these two fundamental discoveries within the domain of science essentially changed the way we look at things from then on. And the scientific worldview has changed. Now, the next step is essentially, how do we put these two ideas, these two pillars of 20th century physics, relativity on the one hand, quantum mechanics on the other. Quantum mechanics, there are various other experiments which have been used to test quantum mechanics at a very small scale level, and that also has turned out to be a theory that can be tested to be correct. And now the problem comes, what about putting these two pieces together? How is it that there is one theory that happens at a very large scale and a completely different thing that happens at a very small scale? How do we put these two things together? When does one stop and the other begin? This problem emerged. Even today, this problem is called the problem of quantum gravity. How do you get a quantum theory of gravity? This problem, people have been struggling with it, but we don't yet have a complete answer, complete, incontrovertible answer to this problem. This is one of the holy grails of theoretical physics today. Yeah? But the pursuit of these problems has actually changed our scientific worldview. Yeah. Now, coming back to the problem, so basically when you read this particular kind of criticism of what was the existent science at the early 20th century, you should bear in mind that the scientific principles have changed over this particular, over the 20th century, and today we are in a position where we can start formulating questions that were addressed. Yeah? So when philosophical problems take on a certain precise nature, in particular, when it moves from the domain of speculation to the domain of verifiability, falsifiability, empirical analysis, empirical study, then it deserves to become science rather than philosophy or speculation. And this is what one is talking about here. On the other hand, if these Vedantic thinkers were merely speculative philosophers, then it would have been put in the dustbin. Essentially, it would have served maybe the purpose of some kind of intellectual cogitation, but at best, it could modify opinion. It would not be something that could be analyzed to obtain truth from a particular point of view. On the other hand, what these people, the Vedantic thinkers, were after was the understanding of the mind and consciousness in objective, incontrovertible form. In other words, and this really is a criticism that obtains today, namely that, all right, fine, we have studied the elementary constituents of matter, but here is this mind with which I am all the time. Why haven't we, as a species, devoted that much attention to the understanding and objective analysis of this mind? In other words, where do these emotions and passions that trouble us come from? Which aspect of our mind is universal? And that's really the problem that is being addressed from the subjective point of view. In other words, the place where these two can have a possible synthesis is when you look at this internal analysis as a science, just as we have a science for studying the physical world. In other words, we need today to extract from all this a scientific analysis of the internal world of human beings. This is where these Vedantic thinkers, to a great extent Buddhists, these people do have a head start. It's been done for 2,500 years. Why? Because this laboratory, the human psychophysical organism, comes for free. Well, not for free, but it is there. It's there available to all of us. Why not analyze it? Just as we try to understand and thoroughly investigate external nature, what about internal nature? Just talking around it by saying that this mind is born out of some material combination, it does not address the problem. It is just talking around the problem. Just as there are different fields of science, physics looks at the basic physical constituents. There are in-principle things which say that, look, this is the same thing as chemistry. But when we study complicated chemical molecules, we do not try to understand it at the level of basic physical entities, namely electrons, protons, etc., etc. We handle the basic entities as those molecules. Similarly, when we study biology, we look at life systems. Those are the window through which we look at reality. Yeah? Why not look at reality through this particular product called the mind? And this is exactly what these thinkers were doing. They were looking at this internal world and trying to get at a universal aspect to it. Just as, so it was, so if you cut through all the various trappings, theology, teleology, etc., 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 what you are going to finally zoom in on is what is the scientific study of this internal organ that we call the mind. Yeah? In other words, there is what these people were doing was they were trying to develop a science of the internal human being, whereas the scientific quest, so to speak, develops a scientific understanding of the external, the external world. Yeah? The comprehensive view can only be obtained when we put these worldviews together. And that part of it is really difficult, but we'll try to address, and wherein lies that difficulty, we'll try to analyze next time. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.